classic fighters of World War I were tough, deadly flying machines. Both sides spread terror with giant strategic bombers. Spy flights gathered intelligence about the enemy. Great artillery guns were directed from the air. Before the war, flying was a young science. It was hard enough to keep these fragile, dangerous flying machines in the air, let alone use them as weapons. This is the story of how military aviation in less than a decade grew from a vague theory to a comprehensive system of warfare. Before the war, the French army led the world in military aviation. It had about 250 aircraft. It staged exercises to simulate the conditions of war and explore the potential of the aeroplane. Planes made tentative steps towards combat. In Mexico in 1913, 2 American mercenaries had the first dogfight. An Italian pilot carried out reconnaissance and dropped bombs on enemy Turks in Libya. But when the First World War began, military aviation was little more than a set of theories. Germany declared war on Russia and France in August 1914. The major forces of both sides were traditional infantry, cavalry, and heavy artillery. But in 1914, for the first time in history, heavier-than-air flying machines were available for warfare. They were put to use right from the start. Eyes capable of flying behind enemy lines could see where artillery shells were falling and direct gunners onto their targets. They could also see enemy troop movements. In Belgium, in the 3rd week of the war, a French reconnaissance pilot saw streams of men in grey uniforms. They were German troops. His warning came just in time to allow the British force to retreat to safety. Two weeks later, in northern France, a Voisin biplane prepared for a routine flight. Up to that time, no aircraft had shot another down. Rifles and handguns had been ineffective. The observer, sitting in the front cockpit, was armed with a Hotchkiss machine gun. In the sky over Reims, the pilot saw a German 2-seater and chased it. The observer fired his machine gun, and the German dropped in flames. The world's first victim of aerial combat. In November, 3 Avros of the Royal Naval Air Service conducted a successful long-distance bombing raid. They hit the Zeppelin sheds at Lake Constance in Germany. They damaged 1 Zeppelin and destroyed a gasworks. By the end of 1914, aircraft had pioneered most of the standard missions of military aviation today. They were accepted as an essential part of 20th century warfare. As the war progressed, speeds would more than double. Aircraft range, size, and deadliness would increase enormously. The needs of war accelerated development far beyond the pace of the early years of flight. But that development would not have been possible without the foundations laid by aviation's pioneers. In December 1903, the Wright brothers made the world's first successful powered flight. They continued to develop their ideas at their own pace, unaffected by experiments in flight on the other side of the Atlantic. In Paris, Gabriel Voisin was among those who doubted stories of the Wrights' achievements. In 1905, Voisin was using the River Seine as a runway to help him launch a series of gliders. He was building and testing them for a syndicate dedicated to the development of French aviation. At a time when the Wrights were making controlled powered flights, Voisin was using a high-powered motorboat to tow his gliders into the air. Voisin would go on to design many great aircraft of the First World War. But in 1905, he still had much to learn. In Paris, a prize of $10,000 was offered for a flight around a 1-kilometer course. One of the sponsors, Ernest Archdeacon, challenged the Wrights.
It will assuredly not tire you very much to make a brief visit to France simply to collect this little prize.
The Wrights did not visit Paris. They didn't have to. They were leading the world and intended to sell their invention to a national government that saw its potential. In the meantime, others in Paris were making attempts to fly. Among them was Brazilian-born Alberto Santos Dumont. Santos Dumont was famous for balloon flights and experiments with gliders. In November 1906, he took his flying machine to the Bagatelle, this playing field near the Bois de Boulogne. He'd already tried to fly with the help of an airship to lift his machine off the ground. It was not successful. On November the 12th, the French aviation fraternity was there in force to witness another attempt, without the airship. Santos Dumont had to stand up to fly the machine. He coaxed it into the air, and in 21 seconds covered a distance of more than 700 feet. It was the first time a European had taken off and flown convincingly. In Paris, Santos Dumont was hailed as the conquering hero. But Wilbur Wright did not share the general enthusiasm.
We do not believe there is 1 chance in 100 that anyone will have a machine of practical usefulness within 5 years.
But just 14 months later, Henri Farman, a dashing young racing driver, would prove Wilbur wrong. In January 1908, Farman, in this machine built by the Voisin brothers, attempted a flight around a 1-kilometer course to win the $10,000 prize. He succeeded. The prize was his, and so was the adulation of France. It was too much for the Wrights to ignore. They had already made a flight almost 40 times as long as Farman's. In the summer of 1908, Wilbur sailed for Paris to show the French what he could do. He set up operations at a racetrack near Le Mans, southwest of Paris. On Saturday, August the 8th, a crowd gathered to witness Wilbur's first flight in Europe. It lasted 1 minute and 45 seconds, slightly longer than Farman's prize-winning kilometer. But it was Wilbur's control that impressed French flyers. Louis Blériot said,
I would have waited 10 times as long to see what I have seen today. Monsieur Wright has us all in his hands.
the Wrights' influence on French aircraft design, especially their control system, was profound. But tragedy struck the Wrights. Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge was killed at Fort Myer, Virginia in September 1908. He was a passenger in the plane Orville was demonstrating to the U.S. Army. It was the first death in the history of military aviation. French aircraft design progressed. By 1909, the idea of a flight across the English Channel was feasible. The British Daily Mail offered a prize of £1,000 for the first successful cross-channel flight. Wilbur Wright was not interested, but others were. On July the 19th, French pilot Hubert Laton made an attempt in his Antoinette monoplane. He flew from the little village of Sangatte, south of Calais. Over the channel, his engine failed. The Antoinette dropped 1,000 feet into the sea. Laton sat on the floating wreckage, lit a cigarette, and waited to be rescued. Laton was not daunted.
I wasn't lucky this time, but the channel will be conquered.
He resolved to try again. Louis Blériot had made a fortune selling car accessories and spent it on aeroplanes. He intended to beat Laton across the channel, but had burned his leg badly on his plane's exhaust. 6 days after Laton's attempt, conditions on the French coast were calm. The competition rules said the flight must begin after sunrise. Sunrise was due at 4:41 a.m. This monument marks Blériot's takeoff point, just south of Calais. As he waited, Blériot's mind raced.
What was going to happen? Would I make it to Dover? Now I thought only of my machine, the engine, the propeller. Everything was going now, everything vibrating. At the signal, the crew let go. I was up.
At first, the flight was very smooth. The Anzani engine of Blériot's plane ran perfectly, and he forgot about the pain from his injured leg. But as Blériot made out the English coastline, the wind strengthened, and mist obscured his view. A stroke of luck allowed him to locate the opening in the cliffs he'd chosen as his landing spot. The landing was rough, but it didn't matter. He'd made it across the channel. Blériot scored an immense triumph. The 21-mile flight from France to England took only 37 minutes. But his achievement had symbolic meaning beyond time, speed, and distance. The world was confronted with the concept that aircraft could cross national boundaries. An island like Britain no longer had a protective moat that could be defended by a mighty navy. The aircraft in which Blériot made his channel crossing was his Model 11. It was to become one of the most popular and effective designs in aviation. This Blériot, from the old Rhinebeck Museum in New York, has an Anzani engine similar to the one that powered Blériot's historic flight. The soundness of the Blériot's design and construction would keep it breaking records and flying as a military aircraft beyond 1915. Seeing one in flight today gives a graphic idea of the flimsiness of aircraft construction at the time and the concentration and skill it took to stay in the air. Blériot's Channel crossing was the first aviation feat to overshadow the achievements of the Wright brothers, at least in the public eye. In the meantime, the Wrights were getting new customers. Early in 1909, the Italian military bought a Wright airplane and hired Wilbur to teach 2 Italian officers to fly it. This film was shot on that visit. It shows Italian political and military personnel watching one of Wilbur Wright's flights with a passenger on board. On the same visit, this film was shot. It's believed to be the first motion picture ever taken from an aircraft. Later the same year, back at Fort Myer in Virginia, Orville Wright completed the task he'd begun in 1908, satisfying the U.S. Army Signal Corps' requirements for a military aircraft. This time, the military flyer passed all its tests of speed and endurance. This actual aircraft still exists. It's on display at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. The Wrights now led the military aviation race, but there were other contenders. Designer-builder Glenn Curtiss was becoming competitive. The Wrights didn't like it. They tried lawsuits to stop Curtiss building and selling his designs. This is Reims, the old cathedral city northeast of Paris. In the summer of 1909, an event held there excited both the public and the military about aviation's potential. On Béthanie Plain, where the Reims military airbase is today, these fields were cleared. An aeropolis with grandstands, hangars, and an air racing course was built. The event was called the Grand Week of Aviation, and hundreds of thousands of people came. Royalty, nobility, and the powerful of politics and military flocked to see the greatest names in aviation compete against each other. Reims Week demonstrated the speed, maneuverability, and endurance of the aeroplane as no one had seen it before. It convinced many military experts that aircraft were potential weapons. Blériot was there, and Lacan, and Gabriel Voisin, and Henri Farman. From America, Glenn Curtiss was there. But the Wright brothers were not. There were some Wright aircraft flown by other pilots. The highlight for the thousands of spectators was a showdown between Louis Blériot and Glenn Curtiss for the Gordon Bennett Trophy. Blériot was the hot favorite, but Curtiss won by just 6 seconds at world record speed, 46 miles an hour. Reims Week showed that aircraft were practical, maneuverable, and by the standards of the time, fast. David Lloyd George, later to become Prime Minister of Britain, summarized its significance.
Flying machines are no longer toys and dreams. They are an established fact.
The Wright brothers continued a legal battle with Glenn Curtiss, trying to protect their control system patents. They became obsessed with litigation against Curtiss and others. Their progress slowed. They were overtaken by their competitors. This Curtiss D is similar to Glenn Curtiss's Reims aircraft. The ailerons used by Curtiss for lateral control are worked by the pilot's shoulders. Small surfaces between the wings oppose each other to make the aircraft bank. It was an attempt to avoid the Wrights' patent on wing warping, in which banking was controlled by twisting the whole wing.
Great cable. No, this cable's good shape here.
Like many other aircraft of the time, this one had an elevator in front of the pilot to control climbing and diving. It was a pusher, meaning that the propeller was at the rear. The person swinging the prop to start the engine had to climb inside a virtual wire cage and hope he didn't trip on the way out. Glenn Curtiss and the Wrights suffered from the fact that flying was not fashionable among American military officers. Politicians were not lobbied for money to support it. American military aircraft didn't evolve as quickly as their European counterparts. Some Curtiss aircraft would achieve distinction in the Great War. They would include a trainer, the famous Jenny, and a successful line of flying boats. The name of Wright wouldn't figure at all. As military aviation bogged down in America, the story across the Atlantic was different. People flocked to aviation events. They subscribed large amounts of money to help its development. The public's enthusiasm was shared by the military. Aviation was seen as a new and dangerous sport, with strong appeal to the dashing and influential military officer class. Military influence persuaded governments to spend money on aviation. Established manufacturers prospered, and new ones appeared. This elegant monoplane is a French Henriot. Its layout is similar to the Blériot and the Antoinette. It has conventional tail surfaces and a single wing, all covered with stretched cloth. But its fuselage borrows from the art of the boat builder. It's wood, constructed in exactly the same way as a skiff used in rowing races. Building a strong fuselage was relatively simple. Attaching monoplane wings to the fuselage with equal strength was more of a problem. Wire bracing was a partial answer. The Henriot was a wing warper, patterned on the ideas of the Wright brothers, each wing twisted to make the plane bank. Wings that twisted could not also have structural rigidity. In Europe, the monoplane was fashionable before the Great War. But most of the significant aircraft produced between 1914 and 1918 would be biplanes. Monoplanes suffered structural failures. It was difficult to make them really strong. Engineers found it easier to design biplanes that could withstand the forces of battle. Flying these aircraft was dangerous. Pilots were inexperienced and control was difficult. Even before aircraft became involved in warfare, They took many lives. Few generals in the armies of Europe had any idea of the way this fragile new toy could be used in conjunction with troops and artillery on the ground. That was all still to come. This is the old Blériot Aéronautique factory in Paris. By 1910, Louis Blériot, aviation pioneer, was fast becoming a prosperous aircraft manufacturer. The Blériot 11 continued to be a success. It established speed records. It flew to high altitudes and over great mountains. There were close calls. It was all a grand adventure. Pilots were seen as heroes. They were people of great daring, courage, and a growing level of skill. This is Adolphe Pégoud, a Blériot test pilot, known to the press as the foolhardy one. In 1913, Pégoud set out to become the first pilot to parachute out of his plane. He intended to reach his planned height, deploy the parachute, and allow it to drag him out of the cockpit. It worked on the first attempt, but
I received a good whack of the stabilizer on the shoulder.
Pégoud expected his Blériot to crash straight into the ground once he left the cockpit, but it didn't. He watched it descend.
My old crate did tricks on its own.
It occurred to Pégoud that he could learn to control the plane's involuntary maneuvers. He trained himself by hanging upside down. He strengthened his Blériot to withstand extra forces. He practiced in private before his first public show. He was not the first to perform a loop, but Pégoud was the first to make a well-planned attempt to explore the extremes of aircraft maneuverability.
To play with the elements of the air in any position and for any length of time, to handle all the treacheries of the atmosphere, and to put myself back on the ground gracefully with calm and confidence, that is my supreme joy.
It was also the joy of the great crowds that came to watch him, and of the many pilots who strove to imitate him and improve on his techniques. He generated a new confidence among his peers. Without knowing it at the time, he laid the foundation for maneuvers that would be soon used in battle by the first combat pilots, in a war that would transform aviation into a potent weapon. In 1913, Roland Garros, an eminent French pilot, made a non-stop 500-mile flight across the Mediterranean. To neighboring powers like Germany, the offensive potential of aviation became obvious. Anthony Fokker, the brilliant young Dutch designer, had moved to Germany. He and other German aircraft builders like Albatros and LVG borrowed freely from French designs. Germany also bought manufacturing rights for the Austrian Tauber monoplane. French experiments in arming aircraft included this unlikely machine gun placement in a Deperdussin monoplane. The gunner stood in the nose, so the bullets would clear the propeller arc. Darts, called fléchettes, designed to be dropped on the enemy, were said to pierce a soldier from head to toe. France held clear leadership in heavier-than-air technology. But Germany had the edge in balloons and rigid airships. Airships were extremely effective in promoting German national prestige. Record-setting international flights by Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin raised a crucial question of international law. Who owns the air? And what would provide the best military platform, the airship or the aeroplane? The airship, with its stability, seemed to have the edge. In the early summer of 1914, such questions were far from the mind of the ordinary European citizen. Crowned heads like King George V of England were aware of the tensions within Europe, but the prospect of war was remote. This is Sarajevo, capital of Bosnia. On June the 28th, the Archduke Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was there on a state visit. Shortly after this film of the Archduke was taken outside the Sarajevo City Hall, a Serbian terrorist assassinated him. The balance of European diplomacy was disturbed. Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany favored Austrian reprisals against Serbia. The French president and the Russian Tsar were allies. Russia and France would support Serbia against Germany. As Europe enjoyed the summer weather, Austria sent an ultimatum to Serbia, demanding that the assassination be investigated. At the same time, Austria mobilized its troops. Serbia agreed to most of Austria's terms, but also mobilized its troops. And then Austria declared war on Serbia. The whole of Europe was pulled into conflict. In Russia, 6 million men were called to arms. Germany prepared to declare war on Russia. There was tremendous public excitement at the prospect. France, Russia's ally, refused German requests to remain neutral. 3 million French soldiers were called into action. France also greeted the prospect of war with enthusiasm. There were old scores to settle with Germany. If Germany and France went to war, Britain could not allow German ships to sail into the English Channel. Britain would side against Germany. Germany was determined to attack Russia, but it knew it must deal with France first. Germany's Schlieffen plan to attack France depended on mobility by rail and road. It involved sweeping through Belgium and down the French coast, swinging east and overrunning Paris. On August the 1st, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia, and the Schlieffen Plan went into operation. Germany believed that it would take 6 weeks for the large, ponderous Russian military machine to grind into action. By that time, German forces would be in Paris. Germany would avoid fighting a war on 2 fronts. The German army swept across neutral Belgium, subduing cities with massive new artillery and making harsh reprisals against resistance. The way into France was open. In aerial warfare theory, reconnaissance and bombing were the 2 major roles of the aeroplane. Both sides used them from the first days of the war. But theory was not practice. In the real conditions of battle, pilots and observers found it difficult to be sure what they were seeing on the ground. Sometimes they brought back information that was wrong. Aircraft like the Maurice Farman Longhorn were primitive, but they were useful for reconnaissance. The Maurice Farman Shorthorn was more sophisticated. It was flown by French and British squadrons early in the war. These aircraft are typical of the two-seaters used for reconnaissance at that time. Getting vital information to the ground quickly was difficult. One method used by both sides was sending messages by homing pigeon. Pigeons were especially useful at sea before radio communication was developed. Chief of Staff of the French armies in 1914 was General Joseph Joffre, an old soldier with experience in the Sahara Desert in the 1890s. One of Joffre's foremost generals was the dashing Ferdinand Foch. Joffre and his armies recalled with bitterness the lost French provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, taken by the Germans in 1871. With the German army pushing into northern France, the French military saw an opportunity to counterattack using a long-standing French plan to recover Alsace-Lorraine. It was called Plan 17. On August the 4th, Plan 17 went into action. French troops crossed the German border, confident that they could restore Alsace and Lorraine to France and drive on to the River Rhine. As the French force was advancing, one of the first failures of air reconnaissance in the war occurred. French aircraft were stationed near the border, but their patrols failed to detect the buildup of strong German artillery and machine guns. Shaken and bewildered by heavy losses, the French retreated. In mid-August, British airmen began to arrive in France. Royal Flying Corps Squadron aircraft started from Dover and entered France wherever the strong Channel winds took them. BE-2s, fresh from the Royal Aircraft Factory, were the first British aircraft in France. A BE-2 landed on French soil on August the 13th. Many more were to follow. Young British airmen found themselves living abroad for the first time. They were only a few miles from home soil in Britain, but culturally, they were in another world. Letters home from these young men were to become some of the most touching and illuminating documents of the war. Much of their sadness comes from the fact that many would be dead soon after setting pen to paper. In August, General Kitchener and 120,000 British troops arrived in France. This time, German air reconnaissance failed. The British arrival was a complete surprise to the Germans. Kitchener ordered his troops optimistically.
Soldiers must be constantly on their guard against temptations both in wine and women. You must entirely resist both, and while treating all women with courtesy, you must avoid any intimacy.
German troops, too, were on foreign soil. German stomachs used to black bread rebelled against the unfamiliar French variety. As German troops approached Paris, the French government vacated the city and left General Gallieni in charge as military governor. Air reconnaissance told Gallieni the Germans were swinging away from Paris to the east, exposing their right flank. The aerial sightings were crucial. They would save Paris and halt the German advance. Gallieni and Joffre decided to attack the German forces in the nearby valley of the Marne River. The German troops were chasing exhausted British and French forces that had retreated 150 miles from Mons. But the Germans were tired, and many had been sampling the local wines on the way. In spite of the condition of the German troops, the battle did not start well for the Allies. In Paris, General Gallieni commandeered 2,000 taxicabs to drive newly arrived Tunisian troops to the Marne battlefield. In 4 days of savage fighting involving over 2 million men, casualties were enormous. For both sides, aircraft were a factor in the slaughter. They were immediately effective, directing artillery fire from the air and reporting on troop movements. By September the 7th, the Germans were beaten. The Schlieffen Plan had been destroyed. The German generals now had no hope of taking Paris and ending the war quickly. The German advance that had traveled so far, so fast, had become a retreat. Now the opposing armies raced back towards the English Channel, trying to outflank each other. As they went, they dug lines of trenches, from which each side would attempt to preserve its own territory. This deadlocked front of trenches and barbed wire would shape the evolution of military aviation for the rest of the war. As the autumn of 1914 moved toward winter, the war on the ground began to bog down in mud. Rain came, and the temperature dropped. In the trenches, there was no escape. But for those flying planes, it was different. If a plane could take off, it could move freely above the wall. This is an Avro 504, not a legendary aircraft, but one of the war's great workhorses. It was a British design, but like many Allied aircraft, used a French rotary engine. In a rotary, the whole engine revolves around a fixed shaft, and the propeller revolves with it. The airflow across the moving cylinders cools the engine. Castor oil lubricant is thrown back in liberal quantities in the face of the pilot. The Avro 504 entered service at the beginning of the war in August 1914. It had the misfortune to be the first British aeroplane to be brought down by enemy ground fire on August the 22nd in Belgium. But there were also early successes. A 504 carried out the war's first ground strafing run, using its Lewis machine gun against a train and German troops on October the 22nd. .504s of the Royal Naval Air Service conducted a series of successful bombing raids into German territory in October and November. The 504 was superseded in combat but for the rest of the war it had a distinguished career as the standard British trainer. This aircraft is the 504K, the last model in a long line of development. More than 8,000 504s were built during the war. It remains a great unsung hero. As the winter of 1914 approached, aviation activity was limited by the weather. For long periods, pilots and aircraft were grounded. Aerial combat was only a few months old. Yet in that time, pilots had experienced the birth of almost every major aspect of aerial warfare. Strategic bombing, reconnaissance, ground attack, aerial combat. They'd tried them all, with some degree of success. The winter was one of the worst for years. When regular flying became possible again, aerial warfare was poised to enter a new phase.
A young aviator lay dying at the start of a bright summer's day. To the mechanics assembled around him, these few parting words he did say. Take the cylinder out of my kidneys, the connecting rod out of my brain. From the small of my back take the crankshaft and assemble the engine again.
In 1915, the French fitted a plane with a machine gun firing through the propeller arc. It was a devastating weapon. Germany discovered the secret and built the world's first real fighter, the deadly Fokker Eindecker. The Fokker scourge began. France answered with the agile Nieuport, and the war in the air became a race for technical superiority. In early 1915, military aviation was making powerful friends among the military hierarchy in Paris. In March, the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle was fought entirely on the basis of maps made from aerial photographs. Bombers were coordinated with infantry for the first time. General Joffre, the French chief of staff, became convinced that aircraft could be the tool to break the deadlock of the trenches. By the time the winter weather cleared and conditions became better for flying, the French Air Service was well on the way to being reorganized, based on the lessons of 1914. Photo reconnaissance units were centralized. Mechanical support was improved. The Air Service was split into three groups: fighting, bombing, and reconnaissance. There was an Allied air base on the coast near the port of Dunkirk called Saint-Paul-sur-Mer. On April 1st, 1915, it was the location for an event of great significance to fighter aircraft. France's pre-war aviation hero, Roland Garros, was stationed there. He was trying out an idea that could make machine guns more effective in the air. Steel deflector plates were fitted to the propeller of a Morane Saulnier N. A machine gun was fitted to fire straight ahead through the propeller arc. In every 100 bullets, about 7 would hit the deflector plates and bounce away. The whole plane could be aimed at the enemy. Garros tried the system in combat on April the 1st, fitted to a Morane-Saulnier L. It worked. He shot down 3 German planes in 3 weeks. On April the 18th, he took off from Dunkirk again, but this time he wasn't so lucky. His plane was brought down behind German lines. The secret was out. Germany asked Tony Fokker, the young aircraft designer, to improve on the French system. And he did just that. The Fokker team synchronized gun and propeller, allowing all the bullets through the blades. They fitted the system to a Fokker single-seater and renamed the plane the E-1. E stood for Eindecker, meaning monoplane. The great German pilot Max Immelmann had the first confirmed victory in an E-1. 3 weeks later, his colleague Oswald Bölker was successful. Bölker and Immelmann led what became known as the Fokker Scourge through 1915. Their tally of downed Allied aircraft mounted. The German press created a rivalry between them. Bölker's approach was simple.
I always wait for the favorable moment and put in a few well-directed shots.
Tony Fokker improved the Eindeckers. This is a scaled-down replica of an E-3, the ultimate version. It had a 100-horsepower engine and sometimes 2 machine guns. It appeared in December 1915. Allied fear of the Fokker continued to mount. The Royal Flying Corps issued this order.
Until we are in possession of a machine as good or better than the German Fokker, a machine on reconnaissance must be escorted by at least 3 fighting machines.
But in some ways, Germany squandered the advantage the Fokker gave it. Tactics for fighter aircraft were still to be developed. The Fokkers often hunted alone or in twos. Sometimes, as in this rare film, they took off to provide escort for Aviatik and Argo reconnaissance aircraft. They were held behind German lines to keep the secret of the gun synchronizing system intact. If they'd been organized into strong fighting units, the Fokker Scourge could have been much worse. The Germans didn't have things all their own way in the skies above northern France. Allied fighter aircraft may have been outclassed for the moment, but sometimes pure natural talent could beat new technology. Leno Hawker was a British pilot with a reputation as a deadly shot. His observer, who was also the machine gunner, complained that
he had the foul habit of carrying an ordinary rifle, which he used to loose off if he didn't think I was doing too well. The noise was most alarming.
The 2-seater British FE-2 fighter was not the right vehicle for Hawker's marksmanship. In a new single-seat Bristol Scout, he came into his own as a deadly genius in the air. The leader of all pilots in the skies above the Western Front was French, Adolphe Pégoud, the inventor of aerobatics. Pégoud was shot down and killed in August 1915. His score was 6 enemy aircraft. He was given a hero's funeral. Even German pilots dropped wreaths from their planes onto his gravesite. In the summer of 1915, a new French fighter appeared. It was used by the French and the British against the menace of the Fokker Eindecker. The Nieuport 11 was known affectionately by French pilots as the Baby. It was small, but very effective. It was originally designed as a racer for the annual Gordon Bennett Cup, but it met the growing needs of the air war perfectly. Although it was the French aircraft, the British government was the first to order it. In July 1915, it went into action with the Royal Naval Air Service in the Dardanelles campaign in Turkey. When it was introduced on the Western Front in the autumn, its speed and maneuverability gave the Allies some hope against the growing menace of the Fokkers. It had one major problem. The V-patterned wing struts allowed the wings to twist under load, sometimes with fatal results. Nevertheless, the Nieuport Baby very quickly became popular among pilots. It had a fast rate of climb, but its main virtue was extreme agility. By 1915, the many different control systems of pioneer aircraft had become standardized. A central stick controlled banking, climbing and diving. Rudder pedals coordinated the turn. The first Nieuport 11s were powered by Gnome rotary engines of 80 horsepower.
Voilà. C'est bon.
The Nieuport had one major disadvantage against the Fokker. French machine guns were not reliable enough in their firing rate for a safe synchronizing system. The Nieuport's gun could not fire through the propeller arc. The Nieuport 11 formed the backbone of the new French pursuit squadrons, or escadrilles. The first of these was N65, located near Nancy in the northeast of France. The job of this squadron was to escort French bombers into Germany and defend the skies above Nancy. It was the first true French fighter unit of the war. Apart from the N65 escadrille, most Nieuport 11s were operated for the time being in the same way as the Germans used the Fokkers, as supplementary aircraft in two-seater squadrons. The Nieuport's Lewis machine gun was mounted in the center of the top wing, so that bullets cleared the propeller blades. The Nieuport lagged behind the Fokker in the sophistication of its gun placement, but it had one great advantage: extreme maneuverability. The Fokker, for all the fear it generated, was an old-fashioned wing warper. The light biplane Nieuport, with its powerful control surfaces, could make moves the Fokker was unable to match. Agility like this could only be exploited by a skilled and naturally gifted pilot. As more sophisticated aircraft became available, a new question needed answering. What characteristics shown by recruits on the ground might indicate a talent for flying in combat? In Germany, France, and Britain, there was a belief that ex-cavalrymen made the best pilots. A good horseman needed good hands. So did a pilot. Manfred von Richthofen was a cavalry officer, and so was his brother Lothar. They were both superb combat flyers. But many men who'd never ridden a horse achieved great success in the air. Whatever the elusive natural qualifications for good pilots, they needed development by specialized training. In France, one of the tools was a penguin. A penguin was a plane with shortened wings, capable of almost leaving the ground, but not quite. The theory was the pilot could get the feel of flying without the danger of taking off. But there was no avoiding the extreme risk of the first solo flight. For French student pilots early in the war, dual control instruction was rare. They progressed in stages, from taxiing to short airborne runs to flights reaching altitudes of about 100 feet. Death in the flying schools was not uncommon. Fatal crashes were never forgotten by those who witnessed them. Rotary engines were a contributing factor. They spin. Gyroscopic forces could be fatal to a pilot turning at low altitude. This is a Caudron G3, used for reconnaissance early in the war and later as a trainer. Victor Chapman was an American volunteer pilot in France in 1915. He wrote about a takeoff early in his training.
The machine left the ground almost immediately. I had to hold it down to keep headway. Then it began to buck, squirm, and wriggle. It slid off to the right, to the left, took a short plunge downward, and then attempted to rear. The earth and a scrawny tree or two looked near and menacing.
No country had a perfect training system. Many pilots were underprepared to join the aerial battle. The Caudron G3's successor, the G4, was an ungainly-looking addition to the French bomber force. The importance of bombing was growing fast. In April 1915, a new terror was launched into battle. German poison gas caused havoc in the trenches near Ypres, on the Belgian border. Panic spread throughout the Allied forces. There was a poison gas factory at Ludwigshafen in Germany. It was the first target for the French Bomber Group No. 1. They had to fly across the Rhine and into the enemy's homeland. The group was based near the city of Nancy in northeastern France, only a few miles from the German border. Its leader was Commandant de Gouin. His command was to be short-lived. The raid was planned for early May, but high winds prevented any action until late in the month. On May the 27th, the wind dropped. The bombs for the mission were loaded onto Voisin biplanes. They were modified artillery shells. Bomb sites at the time were crude and unreliable. Bombing techniques were in their infancy. Everybody had a great deal to learn. Prevailing winds were a problem. They blew from west to east. They helped on the way into Germany. But if they became too strong, they could prevent the slow Voisins from returning home. "17 Voisin bombers left Nancy at 3 a.m. on May the 26th and flew virtually unchallenged into Germany. 87 bombs were dropped on the factory, causing substantial damage. Only Commandant de Bois failed to make it home. Flights over enemy lines increasingly ran the gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire. As experience with bombing raids grew, formations were favored over the earlier go-as-you-please method. Single aircraft were vulnerable to fire from the ground. A lone aircraft provided one target for many gunners. Large formations forced the gunners to aim at different targets, reducing the chance of each aircraft being hit. Both sides developed new anti-aircraft weapons. By the end of 1915, bombers could no longer go unmolested by ground fire. Winter came again, but there was no lull in hostilities. Germany launched a great offensive that would push the air war in a completely new direction. Germany planned to begin 1916 by making an all-out attack on the fortress city of Verdun. Twice in just over a century, Verdun had fallen to Germany. As 1916 began, the German trenches were only 10 miles away. The Germans planned a war of attrition to bring the fortress to its knees. Germany believed that France would fight so hard to save Verdun and pour so many men and so much equipment into its defense that the effort would, as the Germans put it, bleed France white. Verdun was defended by two great forts, but at the beginning of 1916, they were under-equipped, both in personnel and armament. Germany assembled a force of 1 million men and a massive array of heavy artillery to make the attack. The opening move was to be an artillery bombardment, lasting 9 hours. France struggled to prepare. When the attack came, the French were outnumbered by the Germans 2 to 1. The artillery bombardment on February the 21st was the heaviest in the history of warfare. The French frontline trenches were destroyed. The way was prepared for the German infantry to strike. Germany had a terrible secret weapon, the flamethrower. One of the great forts fell. Panic mounted among the population of the city and the surrounding villages. Command of Verdun was given to General Henri-Philippe Pétain, who vowed,
"They shall not pass."
Verdun's lifeline was a road, the Sacred Way. It ran 36 miles to Verdun from Bar-le-Duc. 6,000 trucks a day kept the city and guns supplied. German aircraft made no attempt to bomb them. Bar-le-Duc also benefited from Germany's defensive air tactics. It was not threatened as the Sacred Way's staging point. For 5 weeks, German soldiers were killed at the rate of 1 every 45 seconds. The death rate among the French was higher still. By the end of March, 90,000 French and 80,000 Germans were dead. The German Kaiser declared,
"The war will end at Verdun."
The Sacred Way was not bombed because German aerial tactics stressed reconnaissance and defense. This is a Rumpler two-seater of the period. At the beginning of the battle, 168 similar aircraft were assigned to artillery spotting over the city. Each side had more than 500 planes in the area. But Germany was still benefiting from the Fokker scourge. Allied morale was low. Germany considered that the job of its fighters was to protect reconnaissance aircraft. This Rumpler had a film camera mounted between the outer struts. Film of the pilot and the observer in action were taken from that camera. It appears to be genuine operational footage, but the shots of ground activity are from other sources. Another function of German two-seaters at Verdun was to set up a Luftsperre, a barrage of aircraft theoretically impenetrable by the enemy. They cruised up and down the front inside the German lines. At first, German fighters were reserved to attack enemy planes that made it through the barrage. But as the need for reconnaissance and artillery observation over the battle zone increased, German tactics became more offensive. For a while, German air supremacy over Verdun grew. By 1916, aerial photography was a sophisticated science. Special cameras were developed by both sides. Whole trench systems were mapped from photographic evidence. Photographic reconnaissance and its companion, artillery observation, developed into the most important roles played by aircraft in the Great War. But information gathering behind enemy lines was a dangerous game. Observers had to be vigilant and know how to shoot. The two-seaters of both sides were slower and less maneuverable than the fighters. Many reconnaissance crews perished in the shell holes of no man's land, brought down by a faster and more nimble opponent. Communication between pilot and observer was by shouting. There were no intercoms and no mufflers on the engines. Hand-delivered bombs of this size did little damage on the ground. As the war progressed, bombing grew into a specialized discipline. Random drops from reconnaissance aircraft became less frequent. Any safe return from a reconnaissance mission was greeted with relief. The crew was not only back in safety for a while, but out of the biting cold of open cockpits. Temperatures at 15,000 feet are about 30 degrees colder than sea level. And there's the chill factor of the wind. Aircraft were still scarce and needed to be prepared quickly for the next mission. The ground crews checked engine and structural condition. Pilot and observer wanted to know the number and location of bullet holes in the fuselage. They were an indication of just how close death had come. Aircraft shared the job of artillery observation with balloons. There was strong rivalry between pilots and balloonists. In a French Caco balloon, an observer could be lifted to more than 4,000 feet. Artillery gunners rarely saw their targets. Artillery observers were their eyes in the sky. In good conditions, they could see 15 miles into enemy territory and talk to the ground crew by telephone. Observers could assess the effect of attacks, give artillery directions, track infantry movements, and watch the enemy's reactions. From late 1915, observers had parachutes, but they were hard to use. About once in 100 jumps, they'd fail to open. In aircraft, observers transmitted Morse signals to the ground by radio. But aircraft radios of the time could not receive. Visual codes were used for ground signals to aircraft. Germany had its own types of balloon, performing exactly the same function as those of the Allies. As the war went on, balloons on both sides became the targets of armed aircraft. French Lapierre rockets, air-to-air missiles for balloon busting, were introduced in 1916. These are fitted to a French Farman two-seater, but some Nieuports also carried them. As the Battle of Verdun developed, the Allies reassessed the use of aircraft. The RFC's commanding officer, Hugh Trenchard, believed in all-out attack. He said,
"The sky is too large to defend."
The French formed elite fighter squadrons called Les Cigognes, the Storks. Felix Brocard was one of the Stork commanding officers. His talented pilots included René Dorn. Dorn, a native of Verdun, had 3 victories in the skies above his home city. De La Tour became one of the most famous members of the group. Albert d'Erlin had his first victory in March at Verdun. France recognized early in the war that elite pilots like these had a value beyond their kills in the sky. Their success could be used as tools to lift morale. Pilots with more than 5 confirmed kills were called aces. In 1916, France's aces were concentrated in the Cigogne Escadrille. A posting to the Storks was considered a great honor. Germany had a similar system in which aces were hailed as heroes, but the British did not approve. In March 1916, the Nieuport 17, an improved version of the Baby, began to reach the front lines. It had a 110 horsepower Lerone rotary engine. It was so agile and could climb so much faster than the Fokkers that Germany ordered it to be copied. Germany reacted to the growing number and quality of French aircraft around Verdun by moving some of its airfields closer to the front. French pilots began to encounter German specialized all-fighter groups, equipped with 9 Fokkers each. But the French pilots also noticed a growing performance edge in their own aircraft over the Fokkers. The Nieuport 17 could climb to 10,000 feet in 10 minutes, leaving the Fokker far behind. This is the French ace Albert Derlin, testing the synchronized Vickers machine gun that made the Nieuports better still. In April 1916, a German pilot mistakenly landed a new Fokker E-3 at an Allied airfield. It was tested against a French fighter. It was inferior. The Fokker scourge had already faded, but this was proof that it was over. New French aces appeared. Charles Nungesser ignored injuries, including a twice broken jaw and a dislocated knee, to reach 10 victories in the Battle of Verdun. Georges Guynemer, aristocratic and delicate, began a career over Verdun that would make him the most beloved French ace of the war. In June, Max Immelmann, the great German pilot and tactician, was killed. Germany went into mourning. Oswald Bulcker was now the top-scoring ace of both sides, with 18 victories. This is the French air base at Luxeuil, in the far northeast of France, near the Swiss border. During the Great War, Luxeuil was the home of one of the earliest and most influential French bomber groups. Many lessons about bomber tactics were learned there early in 1915. Group bomber flights and the use of V formations were pioneered in its Maurice Farman aircraft. Luxeuil-les-Bains is an old spa town with natural hot springs. It became very fashionable in the time of Louis XV. By 1916, Luxeuil, like all bomber bases across the front, was changing. Better fighters and better anti-aircraft fire were forcing the abandonment of daylight raids deep into enemy territory. They were replaced by night raids against closer military targets. These aircraft are Farman F-40s, introduced in 1916. Crews disliked them because they had no defense against attacks from the rear. In spite of French government requests for more modern aircraft, the Farman Company kept producing old-fashioned pusher designs. For bomber crews, night raids meant less chance of interception by enemy fighter aircraft or ground fire. But the night raids also meant greater navigation problems and less precision and intensity of attack. Supply of new aircraft continued to be slow. It would be some time before the unsafe and outdated Farmans could be replaced. In the spring of 1916, a group of newcomers arrived at Luxeuil, a fighter squadron of American volunteers. Elliot Cowden, Bert Thor, and Norman Prince pressured for the establishment of the unit. A Frenchman, Captain Georges Thénault, was appointed commanding officer. Second in command, Lieutenant Delage de Mieux, was also French. The other founding members were Americans from a variety of backgrounds. James McConnell originally went to France to serve as a volunteer ambulance driver. At the time, the only way for Americans to fight for France and retain U.S. citizenship was to join the French Foreign Legion. Kiffin Rockwell from North Carolina did just that. He was wounded in May 1915 fighting as a Foreign Legion foot soldier. After he recovered, he transferred to pilot training. Victor Chapman moved from the infantry, hoping for time above the trenches. These young men became the core of the squadron, known as the Escadrille Américaine. They were sent to remote Luxeuil and housed in a comfortable villa. They were supposed to learn to handle their Nieuport fighters and escort the Luxeuil bomber group. But at first, there was little action. Thénault took them on drives through the Vosges Mountains to break the monotony. Kiffin-Rockwell had the group's first victory in May 1916. Then they were moved to Verdun, and the heart of the real war. The squadron had two famous Lion Cub mascots, Whiskey and Soda. Its members also had a reputation for living and playing hard. But they fought as fiercely as anyone else in the war and became an important symbol of potential American involvement. A group of idealistic young volunteers giving their lives to a cause they believed in. German diplomatic pressures in America forced a name change. The Escadrille Américaine became the Escadrille Lafayette. Victor Chapman was the first to die. Patrolling above Verdun, he proved to be too brave for his own good. He was hit in the head and his Nieuport was badly damaged. He landed, demanded a fresh aircraft, and took off again. He charged 5 Fokkers behind German lines and was shot down. His was the first combat death in the war from a recognized American unit. The Escadrille lost Kiffin-Rockwell, who'd had their first victory. It also lost Norman Prince, the major founder of the group, but not from enemy bullets. His Nieuport hit a power line as he was landing. James McConnell, the volunteer ambulance driver, also became a victim of battle. "38 American pilots would fly with the Escadrille before the United States entered the war in April 1917. 7 of them would die in action. Their numbers were small, but their influence on America's entry into the war was great. In June 1916, the British and French planned to launch a massive attack to divert German attention away from Verdun. The location of this offensive was the River Somme, towards the west end of the front line. British aircraft had been fighting above this valley for almost 2 years. Infantry and artillery were massed on a grand scale. The idea was that a mighty infantry assault would break the German line. Cavalry would then sweep through and ride to victory. Hundreds of thousands of men were involved. At a precise moment, they were to break out of their trenches and rush for the German line. A great artillery barrage was to prepare the way. The order was given at 7:30 on the morning of July the 1st, 1916. British troops, each man carrying 66 pounds of equipment, ran into no man's land. This is the little aerodrome at Saint-Omer, a few miles inland from the English Channel. Away from the thick of the fighting, Saint-Omer was the first destination for new aircraft flying from England. They would fly on from here to join their allocated squadrons and the war. Among the aircraft arriving at the time of the Somme battle were Fe-2Ds. They were the latest version of a design that had been in service for much of the war. So far, Britain had built no equivalent to the French Nieuport. Fe-2s and DH-2s, with their old-fashioned pusher layouts, were the best British fighters of the time. The observer sat in front. He had 2 Lewis guns, one firing forward and one back over the top wing. To use the rear gun, he had to stand up. FE-2Bs and Ds, in spite of their old-fashioned looks, could compete with and beat German Fokkers and Halberstadts. They were a major factor in building Allied air superiority before the Somme battle. But the Royal Flying Corps also depended heavily on French aircraft. The great British pilot Albert Ball established his reputation over the Somme. In 3 months, he had an amazing streak of 30 victories in a Nieuport 17. Throughout the summer, Allied planes dropped more than 17,000 bombs. They located German guns. They strafed German troops in the trenches. They were able to reinforce air superiority over the Somme. On the ground, the battle gained little for the Allies. Casualties on both sides were immense. In September, a new French fighter was ready to enter the war. It was a product of SPAD, a company owned by aviation pioneer Louis Blériot. Its designer was Louis Béchereau, and it was called the SPAD 7. It had an inline Hispano-Suiza engine, which handled quite differently from a rotary. The French ace Georges Guynemer was one of the first pilots to exploit the SPAD's potential. Guynemer arrived at the Somme in September with the Stork Escadrille No. 3 under Captain Brocard. His victories during that period brought him many decorations, including the Légion d'honneur. By the end of 1916, he had brought down 25 enemy aircraft. Guynemer called his SPAD Vieux Charles, Old Charles. On one day, September the 23rd, 1916, he shot down 3 enemy aircraft. And then, while flying at 10,000 feet, he was himself shot down, but he was not injured. He made it back to the ground safely. German superiority in the air had disappeared. The months of the Fokker scourge were just a memory. The SPAD 7 reinforced Allied fighter superiority. Pilots like Guynemer and Ball dominated the Western Front. But the pendulum was about to swing again. A new German fighter, the Albatros, was entering the war. For the Allied air services, 1917 would be a nightmare.
A young aviator lay dying at the start of a bright summer's day. To the mechanics assembled around him, these few parting words he did say. Take the cylinder out of my kidneys, the connecting rod out of my brain. From the small of my back take the crankshaft and assemble the engine again.